Good morning to some, good afternoon, good evening to others. Welcome to the second of two webinars on the recent U.S. elections sponsored by the World Press Institute. My name is David McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of the World Press Institute. As many of you know, the World Press Institute is a US-based nonprofit educational organization. And for nearly 60 years, we've had an annual fellowship program in the US for 10 international journalists. We now have nearly 600 international journalists, alumni from over 100 different countries. And unfortunately, we had to postpone our 2020 program because of the pandemic, but we are going to be resuming and are committed to resuming the program in 2021. Before I go into some of the details of this webinar, I just thank two of our partners in presenting these webinars, the America for Bulgaria Foundation and the Association for European Journalists in Bulgaria. The idea for this webinar series actually started with a journalism conference that we had planned to give in Sofia, Bulgaria. But thanks again for the support from the American for Bulgaria Foundation and Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria for making this series happen and helping us publicize it. As I said, the World Press Institute is pleased to present this two-part webinar series. The first part occurred on October 13th, and for those of you who have missed it, it's now up on our website. And Jim Fallows correctly predicted that Biden would win the election. But just a few comments on how this is going to work. First, we're going to hear for Jim Fallows for about 15 minutes on his thoughts on what happened in the elections, what this means for the new Biden administration, both at home and abroad, and what potential roadblocks may stand in the way of the new administration. After these introductory remarks, Michael Montgomery will pose your questions to Jim for the rest of the webinar. Please, when you submit questions, and you can start doing that as soon as you want, use the Q&A function. If you're interested in tweeting about what you are hearing, please use the hashtag #USElectionsWPI. So let me just say a few things about our speaker, Jim Fallows, and our interviewer, Michael Montgomery, before we get this show on the road. Jim Fallows has been a longtime staff writer and correspondent for the Atlantic magazine. He's reported extensively from inside and outside of the United States. Jim began his career as a principal speechwriter for US President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. But since that brief time in politics, he's been a journalist now for over 40 years. Jim has written a number of books and won many awards, and his most recent book about small and medium-sized cities in the US is going to be the focus of an upcoming HBO documentary. In addition, Jim is working or almost completed a major piece about the election, which I think is going to appear in the next print edition of the Atlantic magazine in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. Michael Montgomery, who just appeared on your screen, and who's going to interview Jim and pose your questions to him, is an award-winning reporter and producer for Reveal, the radio show and podcast from the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. Michael's working on a number of projects right now, but one of them is Reveal's upcoming election edition, which will be out on the radio on Saturday and in podcast form, I think at the same time. So check that out if you want. So now, without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Jim Fallows for his opening remarks on what the recent election results mean for the US and the world. Jim?
David, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to join you and Michael and all the other members of the WPI team from wherever you're Zooming in this morning or this evening. Thanks. It's great to be connected this way. Also, as David said, I'd like to echo my appreciation to the America for Bulgaria Foundation and the Association of European Journalists for supporting these presentations. And we hope at some point to have a chance to all get together in person for the conference that we planned for last year or for early this year in Bulgaria. I thought what I'd do now is just give a few overview and introductory comments for a couple of minutes, sort of setting the stage for discussions that we can have that Michael will steer and that will be directed by what's on your mind. So I'm going to touch briefly on 6 or 7 points about the election, what's known, what's not known, where we go from here. First of all, is the results themselves. You recall that last month when we were getting together in this same way, I was saying that if there were anything like a normal process election, Joe Biden was likely to win, just because of a number of fundamentals that I mentioned then that were not expanding Donald Trump's base very much, but were likely to expand Biden's. And it looks for Biden himself as if there's going to be a relatively clear and large margin win. His popular vote margin is now nearing 5 million. I think that's the nationwide vote. It probably will get to 6 million or so by the time the California votes are all included. For perspective, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by about 3 million votes last time. The electoral vote margin will be somewhere in the 290 to 306 total for Biden. So again, by historical standards, this is not a landslide victory, but it's a comfortable victory. It'll be in the same ballpark of Electoral College votes as Donald Trump got last time, of course, with a popular vote majority rather than being short on that. The main surprise for the Democrats is that the strength that Biden and Kamala Harris showed in the presidential and vice presidential run was not carried through the rest of the ticket, that the Democrats had been hoping to win more close Senate races than they did. They won a couple of important ones in Arizona and in Colorado and a few other places, but did not take the seats in Maine or in North Carolina or in Montana or in Georgia, or Georgia will get to, that they were hoping for. And as you know, the Democrats maintained their majority in the House of Representatives under Speaker Pelosi for now, but they lost a number of seats. So in the biggest picture, the results, the most important thing from a US and world perspective that happened in the last week is that Donald Trump lost an election to remain in office. And that is of quite significant consequence, whether you're for Trump or against him. So the results of the election, there's details to come. For example, the control of the Senate is not yet clear, depending on the Georgia runoffs, but that's point one, that Biden did have a substantial margin. Point two is the question of what is happening right now. What is Donald Trump and what are Bill Barr and Lindsey Graham and a number of their associates doing in threatening to file lawsuits and questioning the results, et cetera? There is one backward-looking certainty. That certainty is that through his career, even before he got into politics, Donald Trump has tended to view any result that went against him as having been, by definition, cheating. When he was not nominated for an Emmy for one of his shows, he had a long sort of series of interviews about why the Emmy nominations for television awards were rigged and various bids he has received. And when some of his casinos have run into business problems, he's always viewed results that went against him as having been cheating in some way and to be answered with lawsuits. And of course, you're well aware that in the year before the previous election, the one that he won, he was saying, oh, this is going to be rigged. He's been saying that over the last year or two about this re-election race. So what he's doing now is consistent with his time in the public eye, even before he got into politics. With looking backwards, we see that consistency. Looking forwards, it seems to me overwhelmingly probable. Nothing in life is certain, but overwhelmingly probable that on January 20th at noon Eastern time, Joseph R. Biden will be sworn in to the Capitol as the next president of the United States, and then Kamala Harris after him. The reason I say that is that the lawsuits that the Trump team has filed over the last week or so have virtually all just been dismissed by the courts on preliminary hearing. The one victory they had was a very partial one where a Supreme Court justice said, okay, let's count votes separately until we see how these issues are resolved. But there is almost no legal figure of stature who says, oh yes, these are well-founded arguments that the Trump team is making. So eventually they will be dismissed. eventually the center of gravity in the Republican Party, in my view, will turn against him, as former President George Bush has done, as several serving senators have done. I think that is a tide that will become irresistible. The problem is this is really dangerous while it is happening. While it's happening, and to think of the contrast, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump within 4 or 5 hours after the polls closed that first night to concede to him. And Donald Trump went to the White House 2 days after that to meet Barack Obama. Through the modern history of polling, it's only been in 2000, or of elections, only been in 2000 with George W. Bush and Al Gore, that there was anything more than a day or two's uncertainty in the outcome. Of course, that was the incredible Bush v. Gore recount in Florida. It's worth bearing in mind how different this is from the Florida case in 2000. If any of you remember it, and some of you may have, many of you have read about it, that all came down to one state. Whoever was declared on top in Florida would win the Electoral College. And it came down finally to 500 votes in a state where many, many millions of people have voted. Now there are a significant number of states, all of which have gone to Biden, that are now being contested by significant margins. I think Georgia is the closest one. The margin there now is 10 or 11,000 votes. Nevada is an increasing margin. Pennsylvania is becoming a very large margin, et cetera. So this is a bad moment for democracy to have a sitting president challenging the election itself, and it hasn't happened. It has not happened before. I think 2 months from now, this will be a bad process we went through as opposed to a cataclysm, but that's my reading on that point. Very briefly, for one other point, what is going to happen to Donald Trump if, as I'm saying, he will no longer be the president of the United States? I think, as I mentioned before, it is possible that it's conceivable that Trump might step down, having Mike Pence temporarily as president, who could then issue a pardon to Donald Trump, or some kind of deal with Joseph Biden also for a pardon. The significant fact is the main legal problem for Donald Trump is not likely to be federal laws that a presidential pardon could apply to, but state laws on income tax and various kinds of financial issues, which the New York State Attorney General would be prosecuting, and the prosecutors in Philadelphia and in Florida, Pennsylvania and Florida and California. And a presidential pardon has no influence over those. So if there's to be legal trouble for Donald Trump, it's most likely to be in the state courts. Next, to anticipate a question, I have two other points I'll touch on, then just in a minute or two, I'll turn this over to Michael for a discussion. What does this say about a divided America? My view on this has always been yes, but, or yes, and. When it comes to national level politics, in particular, the views of and about Donald Trump, this is really a divided time in the country, and there are just different views of reality that different sorts of media have encouraged, and the containerization of information flow and things that all of you are well familiar with. And I think that in the realm of thinking about views of national politics, and whether Joe Biden is a socialist or whether Donald Trump is a fascist or whatever labels you'd want to apply, it is a profoundly divided time. Whether it's uniquely divided, it is hard to know, because there have been a lot of bitter elections in American history. I can remember clearly the one in 1968 where Richard Nixon took control, and that was quite divided. And Kennedy and Nixon back in 1960. There have been divisions before. This one does seem intense at the national level. The caveat I continue to make is that the fabric of American society is not in all of its dimensions like these national political rallies. And that if you would think it was in the week before election, you'll see lots of scenes of people waving Trump flags or Biden flags in small towns and thinking that's the entirety of their existence. And in fact, in most of our experience, there's still lots of the social bonds and reasonable compromise and ability to move forward, et cetera, that you would want in a functioning democracy. A brief illustration of this, David mentioned the movie that my wife and I have made that's going to be coming out early next year on HBO. Two of its main figures are people who we portray as really having done everything possible in the most creative ways to make a little tiny town of theirs in Maine internationalized and rebuilt and et cetera, et cetera. If you had to guess when watching this movie, you might imagine these people were lifelong Democrats or whatever. I know them both to be diehard Donald Trump supporters, but it just is not part of the existence that they have in their town. So I'll leave that for now. Let's talk about the three main areas where policy is going to dramatically change and has already begun to. One, of course, is the pandemic. It does seem that as of even a month or two ago, that the Trump administration has essentially just said, this is not our problem. It's not a problem. We're going to let it play out. And there's been just a kind of destructive indifference to the catastrophe, public health and economic catastrophe underway. Many of you saw that yesterday, the Biden-Harris team announced a task force on the pandemic led by many of the scientists who've been unable to connect with the government over the last 8 months or so. Biden is careful to say he cannot do anything until January 20th, but he can prepare and say these are the ways in which we'll be getting ready to do things. So I think the pandemic response will be coordinated internationally and coordinated domestically in a way it hasn't been before. That is one big change. Second change is in the realm of climate. Biden can't do anything about this again until January 20th, but I will be surprised if he does not on January 20th announce rejoining the Paris Accords, resetting standards and goals for various climate goals, rejoining all the different initiatives that the U.S. has neglected and tossed aside. And so Biden is the oldest person ever to take office, I think still recognizes that this is the historic challenge and opportunity he has. The third thing where I think we'll see immediate change involves international engagement. The theme of Trump's speeches and his inaugural address, America First and American Carnage, has been the rest of the world is cheating us. These Europeans, they don't pay their way. These Asians, they're robbing us. These other people, they're sending criminals. Let's just protect ourselves, not then. And I imagine even as of the first day, Biden will reassert support for NATO, support for the EU, support for democratic governance around the world, support for a free press around the world, joining the WHO, et cetera, et cetera. And so that has specific ramifications we can talk with for Europe, for Latin America, for Asia, et cetera. But that's the big picture as I would give it. The results were fairly strong for Biden himself, although the Democratic Party did not do as well legislatively. There is a destructive moment underway now for Trump that's in character for him, but probably almost certainly will not undo the election. The US is profoundly divided at the national politics level, but not in every moment of its fabric. And we're about to see dramatic changes on the pandemic, on climate, and on international engagement. With that, Michael, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Nice to see you. Good morning, everyone from San Francisco, Dobro jutro, to our friends and colleagues in Bulgaria, and hello to everyone else around the globe. We're already getting lots of questions. Again, if you have questions, use the Q&A function. And I know that there is intense interest, Jim, in what is going on in Washington and with Trump. You touched on it. I don't think you can see the White House from where you are, but I know that you know that world. But here, I want to pose one question. I share ultimately your optimism in, a transition and that Joe Biden will be in the White House in January. I want to ask you, is there any kind of even remote scenario in which Trump could try to stay in power, separate from these legal actions? There's speculation which probably gets into conspiracy theories. He He dumped his Secretary of Defense yesterday abruptly. Is there any kind of scenario in which you think he could try to stay in power?
Certainly there are scenarios. They're not scenarios I think would work. And just to explain that briefly, so clearly right now what he's trying to do is to stay in office. He's trying to have his people believe that the result that went against him, and by a large margin, was rigged, fake, dishonest, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a, I don't know if the term Rube Goldberg machine is an internationally known term, but an extremely complex backdoor way where, according to the Constitution, and we had an article in the Atlantic about this, if the will of the voters in a certain state, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, or whatever, is not known, then these legislators of those states can say, okay, we're just going to appoint our people for the Electoral College. We don't care how our state went. And the state where that most matters is Pennsylvania, and then also Georgia, where in Pennsylvania, clearly the vote went for Biden. The legislature is narrowly Republican. In Georgia, the vote seems to go narrowly for Biden, and the legislature is strongly Republican. So you could conceive of their trying to do that, but with so many states going Biden's way, that might not even work. And it requires, and I'll give you one other detail about the legislature in Pennsylvania has said, we're not going to do that. You know, they have said, don't worry about that scenario. We're not going to do it, even though we're Republicans. The lawsuits for trying to declare fraud, they're all about 50 votes here, 120 votes there, when the margins are in the tens of thousands of votes. Again, even the narrowest of these states now, Georgia, is above 10,000 votes now, I think. And usually recounts don't affect that much. On the matter of a sort of military coup or military soft coup where Trump would get the military just to keep him in there, there's a conceptual and a practical reason why I think that is Trump might try it, but it won't occur. The conceptual reason is the military is against him. There is, I've done a lot of interviewing of both sort of the younger service member level and the senior officials level, and they feel as if Trump has tried to corrupt them, has tried to make them into a personal army. The most significant moment here, I think, was, remember back in early June when Trump went out into Lafayette Square holding the Bible, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, was walking with him wearing combat gear. And this was seen as a really controversial and dangerous moment. The next week, General Milley did something I don't know of any precedent for in American history. He went to the National Defense University and gave a speech to a group of officers apologizing for letting himself be put in that position, saying the military cannot be involved in politics, and he made a terrible mistake in judgment in allowing himself to walk with the president there. And the Defense Secretary Esper was just fired, I think has indicated the same thing. So I think that conceptually the military is not, there are not a lot of people who would be sort of coup-ist in the military. Operationally, the way the White House works is at noon on January 20th, the person who the Electoral College has certified is the president. So the Secret Service, all the guards, they will stop. Donald Trump will not have the presidential protection anymore. Joe Biden will. So there is a machine that will run.
And we are getting questions more in this vein, but we know that there's no legal requirement for Donald Trump to officially concede to Joe Biden, correct?
No, there's only a requirement of decency, which of course means it will not happen. And again, in my long political life, I can't recall any circumstance of a president of a losing candidate for the presidency not conceding right away. I worked for Jimmy Carter when he won in 1976, and Gerald Ford called that night, even though he'd lost as incumbent. And I wasn't working for Jimmy Carter anymore when he lost to Ronald Reagan. But again, Carter called Reagan the night. So this is how it is always done. The only legal requirement is the Electoral College. And that happens in the middle of December. I think it's December 13th or sometime. It's about a month from now. And that is officially when a president is elected. And when that happens, the person who gets 270 or more electoral votes is the next president. So that's the official dividing point.
Okay, to just one more question in this theme. We know that the president's can be volatile. He can be not play by the rules. Given that he is likely, if and when he steps down or leaves the White House, to lead some kind of an opposition, to stay in the spotlight, perhaps build a media empire, what is the potential for him to actually sabotage or take steps to sabotage the Biden presidency before he leaves office? There's speculation about Trump taking secrets with him, and who knows what he would do with those secrets, maybe try to monetize them. I'm not talking about treason necessarily, but seriously, if he doesn't play by the rules, what could that mean down the road? And how could he actively sabotage a new Biden administration?
So I think he's doing everything he can right at this moment actively to sabotage a Biden administration, but mainly by questioning its legitimacy and encouraging his supporters to not listen when Joe Biden says, I want to be the president of all of us. I want to represent people who voted against me as well as people who voted for me, et cetera. So right now, Trump is doing everything he can to sabotage things. He has some underling who has not signed transition papers yet, and so is not allowing the transition normal staffing and funding to go on. So I think that I don't know that there will be potential for many of the darker arts of sabotage with international info, because Trump, in my view, has already been collecting this in the past 3.5 years in office. And very soon, the Biden team will get intelligence briefings too. That's part of a normal transition process. And unless Trump really occludes that, Biden will be dealt into all the intelligence. I think the question I think Trump certainly will have some kind of lecture tour and media empire that he keeps going, because the only thing he really likes about being president, in my view, is these big rallies. So he can keep having them. And the question will be, would an ongoing Trump in that role be more destructive to Biden or more destructive to the Republican Party and to anybody who might want to be a future Republican candidate, and it will sort of strap them even more permanently to the Trump team. So that will be bad for everybody, but it could be as bad for the Republicans as for the Democrats.
Well, let's stay for a moment on the domestic situation here. I want to get to foreign policy and the implications of a Biden presidency. You talked about divisions. That is a very common theme right now about divided America. I want to ask you this, though. America was very divided after 4 years ago, after Trump's win. There were a lot of people who did not want to accept Trump as president. Perhaps they accepted the legitimacy of the election, but really never accepted Trump as a president or their president. To what degree is the situation flipped now, Jim? To what degree are we going to have a large, significant percentage of the population that just simply doesn't accept Biden as their president, however that manifests itself? I'm curious your take on that.
So I think there is a similarity, but an important difference. The similarity is when it came to Democratic resistance to Trump was recognizing that he was outside the universe that had contained all previous presidents, that whatever were the norms of office, like turning over your income tax forms or divesting yourself from business interests or all those sorts of things, that he was a uniquely unpresidential figure. And I don't need to sort of elaborate that case. Having his family members in the White House in the same kind of business positions they had, of being vulnerable to flattery by foreign dictators. So he was unique in that way, but very few Democrats or oppositions acted as if he was not allowed to exercise the powers of the office, that he could appoint his cabinet people, and he could get out of the Paris Climate Accord, and he could do X, Y, and Z, even if the opposition thought these were deeply unwise acts. I think there's something similar happening now against Biden, but in a different way of challenging his fundamental right to the office. You know, the difference when it comes to the Electoral College is we could have a poll of audience members here of how many times in the 20th century, which stretched from, Teddy Roosevelt through the end of Bill Clinton, did the Electoral College make a difference in American politics? And the answer is 0, because from 1888 until 2000, the Electoral College seemed like this kind of quaint antique in the attic, and it wouldn't actually matter. I can tell you that, having worked in presidential campaigns, you didn't think it would actually matter. And so the reason people harped on Trump losing the popular vote by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton is it was a much larger case than George W. Bush in 2000 of a 500 vote margin in Florida. It was a significant margin, and it was something that was not normal in American politics. And it is so that was not saying Trump doesn't deserve to be in office, but it's worth noting this uneven mandate he had. In this case, Biden has both the Electoral College and what will be a large national vote margin, let's say 6 million votes, which will be a larger share of the vote than Ronald Reagan got in 1980. There were 3 parties then, and a larger share than Barack Obama got against Mitt Romney. So it's going to be a significant share of the national vote. So I think Trump is encouraging something different from the resistance that he faced, which was challenges to whether Biden deserves, is entitled to hold the office.
I mean, I certainly think it's a positive that so many people turned out to vote. I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, and also that the election day was very peaceful, very orderly. A lot of us were quite concerned about that. We should knock on wood, because you never know what's going to happen. But let me ask you this: we're getting questions on this as well. What is the future of the polling industry in America? I mean, let's talk about that, because it has implications worldwide, and in some ways, the polls weren't as off as some people say, but they were definitely off in some areas. What's your take on that?
Yes. So I should say I've never been a polling industry guy, so I don't have any firsthand expertise here. But it certainly seems that the closer, the more fine-grained the poll, the more likely it was to be off this time. That the polls that were most off seemed to involve Senate races, where it looked as if Susan Collins was going to lose in Maine, the Republican senator in Maine, and she won pretty easily. And as if Lindsey Graham might be in trouble in South Carolina, and he won going away, and several other races of that sort where the Democrats thought they had a chance. The one that I was noting was in Montana, where the current Democratic governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, looked as if he had a good chance to take the Senate seat, and again he lost pretty clearly. So I don't know what it is, whether it's shy Trump voters, whether it's people who don't answer phone calls at all. I don't know what it is, but certainly to the extent that polling is driving policy and investment of resources, it seems unreliable. On the largest national scale, if Biden ends up having a 6 million vote margin, let's say, that's within range of what was predicted for him, as was Hillary Clinton's national margin back in 2000, back 4 years ago. It's the state by state fine-grainedness that is off. And I think, yes, the polling industry faces some existential questions about what all this money is going for.
A lot more questions coming in. I'm going to try to encapsulate them with questions about the future of the Electoral College. Let me ask you generally, do you see any fundamental structural changes that could possibly come out of this election? Things like the Electoral College, the way we vote, and anything there separate from what Joe Biden can do, in terms of executive action, et cetera.
So did we talk last time about the way the Electoral College might have worked in 2004? This is actually an interesting parallel. So just to, and then we can talk about some of these other structural issues. You all recall that in 2000, George W. Bush beat Al Gore by the tiniest of margins, by only the state of Florida. Lost the national vote by about 500,000, but won the Electoral College by one state. 4 years later, running for re-election, George W. Bush against John Kerry, Democratic nominee. It turned out that Bush won both the national vote and the Electoral College. But if a very, very small number of votes in Ohio, about 70,000 votes, had gone the other way, so that Kerry carried Ohio rather than Bush, you would then have had the reverse of 2000, where John Kerry would have won the Electoral College and become president, but lost the national vote. And I think if that had happened, you would have had some bipartisan movement from Republicans and Democrats, both to say this Electoral College is crazy, because we've each now seen the way it distorts our results. That didn't happen, obviously, and Republicans now think correctly that the Electoral College magnifies their leverage. And since a constitutional amendment requires, 3/4 of the states to go along, that's not going to happen. There is a workaround way. Did we talk about the National Popular Vote Compact last time? I don't remember. This is something worth looking up. I'll do it in the chat later on. It's a voluntary agreement among states. State legislatures, as we mentioned, they control how electors have to vote. And if you have states saying that they will commit their state's electors to whoever wins the national vote, and that this pledge will become effective when enough states to represent 270 electoral votes take the pledge, that is a constitutional way you could essentially get around the Electoral College without formally abolishing it. A number of big states have already agreed to this. Smaller states, we'll see that the battle goes on. The main point is the Electoral College for 120 years almost, nobody thought it mattered. Now it's the way both George W. Bush and Donald Trump got in. And so there's going to be a lot of attention to this. Several other things that can be changed without constitutional amendment. The size of the House of Representatives. I direct everybody's attention to a wonderful report called Our Common Purpose by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And maybe David or somebody can put that link into the chat. It talks about 10 or 15 really important reforms in democracy you could make without amendment. One of them is saying that through American history, the House of Representatives has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger as the population has, but it's been more than 100 years since that has happened. So it would make sense if there were a 50 or 100 new congressional districts, and that would get rid of some of the gerrymandering pressure and some of the big state, small state imbalance. So that is one kind of reform. After the 2000 election, there was a bipartisan commission on voting reform, which got in a lot of reforms, including the whole idea of provisional ballots, which I'll just mention and not go into. I think there should be a reform on this kind of bipartisan election reforms. The Supreme Court, there's a way to increase its size that is consistent with past practice. The Supreme Court has also varied in size over the years. The reason it got to 9 when there were 9 circuit courts around the country, and the idea was to have one justice for each circuit court of appeals. It would make sense to create a couple more circuit courts of appeals because, for example, the Ninth Circuit in the western half of the country is enormous and has, as many cases as practically 5 other circuits put together. So you could create some new circuits and that would justify having new justices on the Supreme Court. Or you could have life terms you could have 18-year terms for Supreme Court justice.
And Joe Biden has talked about creating a commission to look into this rather than just accepting pressure to agree to expand the Supreme Court, what some people call packing the court, although that's not what.
And so you can call it packing the court if you think it's terrible. You call it reforming the court if you think it's good, and you appoint a commission if you want to find some way to see what we can work around here.
Right. I do want to move along here. So a quick question on the Georgia Senate race. We know that there will be The control of the Senate is hanging in the balance. It's at 40, and you have two runoffs that will be in
Yes.
January. If the Democrats could win both those runoffs, which is a bit of a long shot, they would control the Senate with Kamala Harris's vote. That's a big deal. I mean, if somehow they ended up with a slim margin controlling the Senate, that would be a very different situation for a Biden administration.
That would be the second biggest change in the politics of the resulting from this election. The first biggest is the change from Trump to Biden, but the second biggest would be the change away from Mitch McConnell as majority leader, because McConnell has really been just about obstructing whatever is the Democratic Party objective. And I think that the blocking of Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination is the clearest instance of that. So just for those who have not delved into all the minutia, Georgia is different from most states. A candidate for Senate has to get at least 50.0% of the vote to win the election. Otherwise, there's a runoff. And each of the two Republican incumbents, Senator Perdue and Loeffler, each is just below the 50%, although they're ahead. So the question is whether the two Democratic candidates, whether the same energy and turnout that apparently has changed the presidential vote in Georgia, whether that also is going to work for the Senate races. And I think that is still almost 2 months from now. So you have a sort of mini presidential intensity over the next 2 months there.
And there's been speculation whether Trump will actually go down and campaign in those races as while he's still in the presidency. We did not talk about this last time. I have to ask you that, obviously after the killing of George Floyd, there has been an incredible protest movement in the United States against racism, structural racism. It's been very powerful. I think it certainly, without a doubt, inspired a lot of people to go out and vote. What will be the relevance of that movement, of those demands for challenging structural racism in the U.S. With the Biden presidency? How will that play out?
I think they'll be highly relevant because both because of the experience of this past year, which has involved the pandemic disaster and economic catastrophe and all the racial justice reckonings coming, especially from police violence being shown around the country. So I think that on the merits, Biden and certainly Kamala Harris recognize this as their duty. That's one argument. Second, there were many ingredients of Biden and Harris's nationwide victory, but a mobilized African-American vote was very, very important to them. And Georgia is the clearest case, and Pennsylvania is the second clearest case, with a vote from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and going in their direction. So it is of political centrality too. Also, the personal stories of both Biden and Harris, I think, are relevant here. Biden, and that 50 years ago almost, when he was in politics, he was sort of a law and order guy, and he is clear in saying this is something where he recognizes that he was wrong early on. Kamala Harris is, of course, a mixed race person herself, of Indian and Caribbean descent, has been a prosecutor in California. She went to Howard University in DC, and so again, she is the first woman ever to be vice president, and the first, the second non-white person to be in executive office. We'll come to Charles Curtis in a second. So I think that she has personal standing and personal background to say, this is my cause as well. I've enforced the laws, but also I've lived my entire life in this skin. And I know what it is like in the United States to live in this skin.
All right, let's move to foreign policy. Lots of questions on that. You touched on this briefly, the expectation, and this is something that, of course, the president has a lot of leeway on in terms of foreign policy, that President Biden will work quickly to repair relations with some of our closest allies. How do you see this playing out? Let's start with Europe, NATO. What kind of steps do you anticipate a Biden administration will take? And also in that question, who do you see will be his Secretary of State?
On the steps, I think that it's, there's a long sequence of dominoes of things, of agreements that will be reassembled, and ambassadors that will be appointed, and conferences that will be reattended, and all that sort of thing. I think that most of what Joe Biden will do on Europe, he can do in the first hour that he is in office, simply in his inaugural address, where he will say, we recognize that we are part of free societies around the world. And while free societies have their obvious differences, we have certain common values that it is in our interest, ours Americans, to pursue. We recognize that every cause we care about in the long run, from war and peace to climate to disease control to nuclear safety, all depends on working together rather than separately. We recognize that we all are affected by trade, it's dislocating in many places, but we recognize it makes us richer. We recognize that the flow of people is important to all our societies, but it has to be humane and fair. He can go down the long list of things in which the US has differences, but fundamental commonality with most of the world, with the democratic world, with NATO, with the EU, with everything else. So I think that is 90% an initial signaling, and then throwing the switch. On who would be his Secretary of State, I think that probably all of you are better informed than I on a list of the mentioning list. And I'll ask you that, Michael. Who's your list? I think they all would be more or less the same in terms of the policies they carry out. But Michael,
Well,
I'll turn that to you.
I'll make that into a question back to you. I mean, we see, for example, Susan Rice, her name mentioned very much at the top of the list, which arguably would suggest a continuation of democratic establishment, foreign relations, continuation of Obama years policy. And we have an interesting question from Ani, which is, haven't some things permanently changed? In other words, can the Democrats go back to the sort of traditional foreign policy we've seen, or have some things fundamentally changed under Trump? And let me ask you, on top of that, have we seen the end of this idea of American exceptionalism, that we are no longer the greatest country in the history of the world, the force for democracy around the world? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe there's going to be a much more modest approach. I'm interested, because even some liberal commentators have talked about the Trump legacy in this sense, in a positive way, which is staying out of foreign wars, and ending this notion that we are the beacon of everything good in the world.
Yeah. On whether things have fundamentally changed, every day off the calendar leaves a mark, and the U.S. can't undo fully what it's done in the past few years to its alliances, to the world, to the time that's lost on climate, to all, the last 4 years have happened. I think that if people talk about, back to the Obama establishment or back to the Democratic establishment, when it comes to international policy, to me, that is different from talking about, say, a Treasury Secretary, who would be a continuity from the Obama years, in that the international policy of the Obama years, to me, would be centrist U.S. liberal internationalism of simple things, of viewing us rather than them, of looking at NATO and thinking, let's work together rather than you're trying to cheat us. And looking at NATO and thinking we have more in common with NATO than with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So I would view it to be expected, and from my lights, actually positive, if on the diplomatic front, there were some kind of continuity. It's always going to change. The last 4 years have led their mark. Dealings with China, especially, are constantly recalibrated, et cetera, et cetera. On the American exceptionalism, I have always been an American exceptionalist in the following narrow way. I have always viewed the idea of the United States as exceptional. And the idea is that, in principle, the nation can incorporate and embrace everyone. Not everybody in the world is a potential French person, but although France has become much more an immigrant society, but the U.S. is by definition an inclusive society, and therefore the idea of its exceptionalism that I believe is the one that I think Obama often expressed, which was the constant becomingness. The U.S., any decade of American history has its tragedies and failures and sins and cruelties from the Civil War and of course the centuries of slavery. And there is also this idea that it can become something else. The two kinds of American exceptionalism I have always thought are wrong are we are so great. You are little, we are big, sort of what I would think of as red hat American exceptionalism. We are just better than you are. I'm saying we're different than most other countries. The other is moral hubris, which you can associate either, say, with Woodrow Wilson, with his idea of, a century ago, or even strangely, the inaugural address of George W. Bush. That this was going to be, U.S. was going to really be exporting democracy every place. And that was one of the many reasons they thought behind the Iraq War, a disastrous war in my view. I think that over the centuries, the U.S. has oscillated between intrusiveness and withdrawal with the rest of the world. It has intruded what it felt it should. It's withdrawn as its hands have gotten burned. This burns other people's hands too. I think that is a, a built-in oscillation in American life. I think what I'm calling the becomingness exceptionalism of American life, I think that is still there. I hear it in Biden's speeches, and I hope it's still there.
Let's ask. We are getting more specific questions about China and Russia. Those are issues, particularly China, that are very sharp issues right now, economically, diplomatically. You lived in China. You are a China expert, among other things, among other expertise you have. What do you anticipate a Biden administration? How will it deal with China differently or not than the Trump administration has?
I think it's going to. I think the problem of the Trump policy towards China, in my view, is that it was both senselessly antagonizing and hostile, whereas not, while at the same time being sort of cynically kowtowing. And the response to the pandemic sort of illustrates the worst of both worlds. That Trump withdrew many of the U.S. public health observers from inside China last year, so they weren't there on scene to detect the origins of the pandemic. But then he was so eager to make a trade deal with Xi Jinping that he was flattering him for the first couple of months and was too easy on China. He was about too hard on China and too easy on China. I think that in a variety of realms, the Biden policy would be what the Obama policy was becoming at the end of his time, which is not adversarial in recognizing that China should not become an enemy, that things will become worse if it's in the actual enemy category, but much more difficult, and recognizing that in almost any realm you can think of, from cybersecurity to intellectual property to balance of trade issues to transparency to censorship, it is becoming a harder rather than easier relationship. And I think there is a way to balance those two things, to say, we don't want to start a war with China. We don't want to be on wartime footing with China, but we recognize there's an expanding array of areas where the world in general is having a more difficult time with China under Xi Jinping than it did under Hu Jintao. So I think it will be an all fronts engagement, engaging on a lot of these contested issues, as opposed to talking about as opposed to wartime rhetoric.
Also, questions about U.S. relations to Africa, African countries in Africa. And also South America. I mean, we could go a long time, but
Yeah.
it's true that, because of the nature of the Trump presidency and because of the media's obsession with everything Trump tweets or says, we see very little coverage in the media on African countries, South America. Any significant shifts you expect with the Biden administration?
I think that, if let's assume that Susan Rice has played some role in the administration. She's had, among her many areas of expertise, she's had a lot of experience with African policies, and that would probably be something that got more attention just generally. If, to the extent US policy for the last 4 years has been both oratorically hostile and dismissive to everybody, that is likely to reverse. It also, there will be the State Department and the diplomatic corps have been, to a shocking degree, hollowed out in a lot of their working terms. It's consular offices are not being able to process visas. The information flow has also been cut off. So I think you'll see an effort to have a real kind of flow of people into the work of diplomacy. And a lot of that would go to places where it's been cut off in Latin America and Africa.
And that can happen quickly in terms of the State Department. That's something Biden can move on
Yes.
very quickly, right?
And he can try to bring in people for like mid-career assignments. And so without, we could talk about this for a long time too,
Right.
but I think this can happen quickly, and it would be a natural thing. Democratic administrations often are looking for ways to have ambitious experiments they could do in other parts of the world that could be of economic, public health, and other benefit there.
Just want to remind people we're approaching the hour, but we're going to keep going till about 10 after the hour. It strikes me as another change we'll see is rejoining, strengthening multinational, multilateral organizations, the World Health Organization rejoining, but also United Nations. Another thing we don't hear much about because not that the United Nations isn't doing anything, but Trump just so absorbs the spotlight. I gather that would be another area that the US could push in terms of the diplomatic world, which is we're really re-engaging with the United Nations.
Yes, and I think a simple way to put this is that the Biden people, whoever ends up as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, will recognize that the most important component of US power over the years has been alliances and soft power, as opposed to simply aircraft carriers. And that is the kind of power that Trump has most purposefully just taken a blowtorch to. So I think joining the WHO, again, on the first day, I expect shoring up relationships with the UN. I think there will be both a high road and a low road. If you hear high road is, this is what we should do because we're all going to be better off. The low road is, this has been a major, major force magnifier for the US since at least the end of the Second World War. So it'd be crazy to continue to let this go away.
Okay, I've got a double question for you. There has been a movement, a populist movement globally, powerful forces, leaders in an assortment of places, Philippines, Hungary, Turkey, Poland, and in some cases, Russia, if you will, cases where Trump has had bromances with some of these leaders. That obviously will change under Biden. First of all, what impact does the Biden victory have for this global populist movement? And then I do want to ask you about Russia in that, we could see a more aggressive or a different posture in the terms of the US in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, vis-a-vis Russia, and possibly Afghanistan and parts of the Middle East, Syria. I know that's a lot of stuff to unpack.
And I'll be as concise as I can. On the so-called global populist issue with the Philippines and Hungary and wherever you're going to name these, I've always preferred to use a term other than populist, because populist to me suggests that it's mainly economic anxiety. And of course, that has been an element over the last 20 years in dislocations around the world. But I think more and more, especially in the US, this is much more clearly a nativist and tribalist and sectarian, and in some cases, racialist, if you will, view that the voting patterns in the US have been the higher your income, the more likely you were to vote for Trump this time. The lower your income, the more likely you were to vote for Biden. And so I think of these nativist and authoritarian movements around the world, I think that the defeat of Trump is an important possible turning point for them. They'll be dealing with Joe Biden, and I think it will depend sort of country by country on the dynamics there. About Russia, I think it has been a shift of tone during the Trump era. I mentioned earlier that China, I think, should be thought of as an all fronts challenge slash problem as opposed to an actual enemy. I think there is a lot of sense on both parties in the US in the last half dozen years that Putin has acted as an enemy agent, that the Chinese may have, done a lot of cyber interference with how things are happening in the United States, but it doesn't seem as if they're going out of their way to sow chaos in the US. There seem to be more hypotheses that Putin has been going out of his way to make things difficult in the US. So I think there also the fundamentals so I think there'll be a recalibration and a much, much greater skepticism of Russian policy under Biden. And it's, the details of that, I will leave to those who know much more than I do. But I think that Putin must be recalibrating what this means for the relationship. And I will leave it there for now.
I'm thinking about some of my colleagues in countries that have seen huge crackdowns on freedom of the press, on media control, thinking about our colleagues in Bulgaria and what they've been dealing with. Can a Biden administration do more than just change the tone? I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about freedom of the press globally. We know the power of U.S. embassies, the power that some U.S. embassies can have. Do you expect, what can our colleagues around the world expect from the U.S. on that front?
I expect a radical change. And as you say, on the one hand, U.S. embassies cannot and should not be interfering in the politics of their host countries. And that's a careful line they have to walk. But they can be speaking up for freedom of expression. They can be speaking up for human rights protesters and crusaders. By the kinds of people they invite for dinners at their embassies, for the kinds of people they meet, for the kind of events they sponsor, for the kinds of Americans they bring in to speak there, they can send signals of what is the kind of expression the US would like to stand for rather than against. I think especially in Europe, you've seen some of the opposite signals in the past few years. I'm thinking especially of Germany when Grenell was the ambassador there. So I think in all the ways in which these signals and cultural and soft powers can shift, the US should not be involved in any other nation's politics directly, but it should stand for interests that democratic societies share. I think there'll try to be a signaling in that direction.
Okay, we're running down to our last couple of questions. I got to ask you this one. We just came in from one of our colleagues here. You touched on it, but what is the likelihood that Trump could end up in jail? Not obviously, most likely these cases in New York, allegations of tax fraud. Is that possible? And do a lot of his actions right now relate to that, protecting himself and his family?
I think it's certainly much greater than zero, probably less than 50% chance that any of us will see Donald Trump in an orange prison outfit someplace.
You mean that would match his hair?
But Paul Manafort showed that if you're in prison and you can't touch up your hair, suddenly you have a different look. And it's because it appears at face value, many of the tax deals he has made, many of the financial arrangements he's made over the last 20 or 25 years, especially in New York, and those that are recent enough to be subject to prosecution, those seem to cross the line of state financial crime. So we'll see whether I think state attorney generals might find it worth prosecuting him, maybe in the end they would decide it was not worth it to the US to have him do actual prison time. But it seems to me 50% likelihood he will face some kind of criminal prosecution. Less than that, he would actually do time.
We're running out of time for maybe one or two more questions, and I just appreciate all these questions that everyone has sent us. It's really remarkable. Big tech, what's the potential for a serious push against big tech monopolies or monopolistic practices, especially if the U.S. aligns more with Europe? Given what we're seeing in Europe. I mean, could there be a serious effort to dismantle some of these companies or certainly their power under a Biden administration? I know that's a big question, but
yeah. So the short answer is yes, from my point of view, and I say it, I guess the two main reasons I'd say it is just as a historical matter, as I think we did discuss last time. It's sort of like the original age of monopolies 100 and 120 years ago. You had new technologies creating new concentrations and new dislocations that led to the original era of antitrust in the U.S. I think we are due, both the US and Europe, are due for a recalibration on antitrust. So on the merits, I think the time is right. And in politics, this is the rare thing where both Republicans and Democrats have been talking about this for different reasons, but towards a similar goal. And also Europeans and North Americans are talking about it too. So I would be surprised if there weren't the beginning of some recalibration of antitrust tech concentration in this era, both in North America and in Europe.
I see David coming in. I'm just going to throw in one more question.
Sure,
David.
one more question. Sorry.
Okay, great. We didn't touch on the Middle East, and that's a huge topic. Yeah. We did get a question from Shakir in Kuwait, which is, to what degree will the dynamics change? He's asking about the Gulf, but if you can broadly, Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's some big relationships. We've seen some diplomatic movement under the Trump administration, if you will, in that area, some disagreement over that. But big picture, what do you anticipate?
Fortunately, we're in an area where my expertise is one half of an inch deep. So I can say that I believe the Biden team will try to draw on such promising developments as Trump has created. If there are some peace agreements that seem promising, I think Biden's team will try to extend them. And otherwise, I don't know enough to make any kind of constructive statement here. But there are a lot of people who will be around Biden who've spent their careers on Middle Eastern politics. So you'll have no shortage of more authoritative statements on this theme.
Great, thank you.
You want to ask one more, Michael?
Oh, there are so many questions. Okay. I guess, Jim, just tell me it's all going to be okay.
It's going to be better.
Okay, well, thank you all for participating, and thank you, Jim and Michael, for your presentation and discussion. And stay tuned, everyone. We're hoping to do some more of these webinars and some other topics coming up. So, and one last question that came up, I think, on some of the Q&A is that the first webinar is on our website, and this one has been recorded and will be up in a couple of days. So, thank you all, and appreciate Jim and Michael and everybody attending this webinar.
Thanks, everybody. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.